Hello and welcome to part 3 of our Winter's Tale, The Hunter's Wife by Anthony Doerr. Bruce Maples gasped when the hunter's wife finally arrived. She moved through the door like a show horse, demure in the way she kept her eyes down, but assured in her step. She brought each tapered heel down and struck it against the granite. The hunter had not seen his wife for 20 years, and she had changed, become refined, less wild, and somehow to the hunter worse for it. Her face had wrinkled around the eyes, and she moved as if avoiding contact with anything near her, as if the hall table or the closet door might suddenly lunge forward to snatch at her lapels. She wore no jewellery, no wedding ring, only a plain black suit, double-breasted. She found her name tag on the table and pinned it to her lapel. Everyone in the reception room looked at her and then looked away. The hunter realised that she, not President O'Brien, was the guest of honour. In a sense, they were courting her. This was their way, the Chancellor's way. A silent bartender, tuxedoed coke girls, big icy drinks. Give her pie, the hunter thought. Rhubarb pie. Show her a sleeping grizzly. They sat for dinner at a narrow and very long table. 15 or so high-backed chairs down each side and one at each end. The hunter was seated several places away from his wife. She looked over at him finally, a look of recognition, of warmth, and then looked away again. He must have seemed old to her. He must always have seemed old to her. She did not look at him again. The kitchen staff in starched whites brought onion soup, scampi, poached salmon. Around the hunter, guests spoke in half whispers about people he did not know. He kept his eyes on the windows and the blowing snow beyond. The river thawed and drove huge saucers of ice towards Missouri. The hunter felt that old stirring, that quickening in his soul, and would rise in the wide pink dawns, grab his fly rod and hurry down to the river. Already, trout were rising through the chill brown water to take the first insects of spring. Soon the telephone in the cabin was ringing with calls from clients, and his guiding season was on. In April, an occasional client wanted a mountain lion or a trip with dogs for birds, but late spring and summer were for trout. He was out every morning before dawn, driving with a thermos of coffee to pick up a lawyer, a widower, a politician with a penchant for wild cutthroat. He came home stinking of fish guts and woke her with eager stories. Native trout leaping 15-foot cataracts, a stubborn rainbow wedged under a snag. By June, she was bored and lonely. She wandered through the forest, but never very far. The summer woods were dense and busy, not like the quiet graveyard feel of winter. Nothing slept for very long. Everything was emerging from cocoons, winging about, buzzing, multiplying, having litters, gaining weight. Bear cubs splashed in the river. Chicks screamed for worms. She longed for the stillness of winter, the long slumber, the bare sky, the bone-on-bone sound of bull elk knocking their antlers against trees. In September, the big game hunters came. Each client wanted something different. Elk, antelope, a bull moose, a doe. They wanted to see grizzlies, track a wolverine, sure sandhill cranes. They wanted the heads of 7x7 royal bulls for their dens. Every few days he came home smelling of blood, with stories of stupid clients, of the Texan who sat, wheezing, too out of shape to get to the top of a hill for his shot. A bloodthirsty New Yorker claimed he wanted only to photograph black bears. Then he pulled a pistol from his boot and fired wildly at two cubs and their mother. Nightly, she scrubbed blood out of the hunter's coveralls, watched it fade from rust to red to rose in a basin filled with river water. She began to sleep, taking long afternoon naps, 3 hours or more. Sleep, she learned, was a skill like any other, like getting sawed in half and reassembled, or like divining visions from a dead robin. She taught herself to sleep despite heat, despite noise. Insects flung themselves at the screens, hornets sped down the chimney, the sun angled, hot and urgent, through the southern windows. Still, she slept. When he came home each autumn night, exhausted, forearms stained with blood, she was hours into sleep. Outside, the wind was already stripping leaves from the cottonwoods. Too soon, he thought. He'd take her sleeping hand. Both of them lived in the grip of forces they had no control over. The October wind, the revolutions of the earth. The winter was the worst he could remember. From Thanksgiving on, they were snowed in. The truck buried under 6-foot drifts. The phone line went down in December and stayed down until April. January began with a chinook followed by a terrible freeze. The next morning, a 3-inch crust of ice covered the snow. On the ranches to the south, cattle crashed through and bled to death, kicking their way out. Deer punched through with their tiny hooves and suffocated in the deep snow beneath. Trails of blood veined the hills. In the mornings, he would find coyote tracks written in the snow around the door to the crawl space. 2 inches of hardwood between them and all his winter hoard, hanging frozen beneath the floorboards. He reinforced the door with baking sheets, nailing them up against the wood and over the hinges. Twice he woke to the sound of claws scrabbling against the metal and charged outside to shout the coyotes away. Everywhere he looked, something was dying. An elk keeling over, an emaciated doe clattering onto ice like a drunken skeleton. The radio reported huge cattle losses on the southern ranches. Each night he dreamt of wolves, of running with them, soaring over fences and tearing into the steaming carcasses of cattle. In February, he woke to coyotes under the cabin. He grabbed his bow and knife and dashed out into the snow barefoot, his feet going numb. They had gone in under the door, chewing and digging the frozen earth under the foundation. He unbolted what was left of the door and it swung free. Elk arrows were all he had, aluminium shafts tipped with broadheads. He squatted in the dark entrance, their only exit, with his bow at full draw and an arrow knocked. Above him, he could hear his wife's feet pad quietly over the floorboards. A coyote made a coughing sound. Others shifted and panted. Maybe there were 10. He began to fire arrows steadily into the dark. He heard some bite into the foundation blocks at the back of the crawl space, others sink into flesh. He spent his whole quiver, 12 arrows. The yelps of speared coyotes went up. A few charged him, and he lashed at them with his knife. He felt teeth go to the bone of his arm, felt hot breath on his cheeks. He lashed with his knife at ribs, tails, skulls. His muscles screamed. The coyotes were in a frenzy. Blood bloomed from his wrist, his thigh. To be thrown off.